if you want to read a text that oversimplifies into a binary of oppressed and oppressor, read certain biblical passages, right? And it's very just clean. There's oppressors and there's the oppressed, right? There's the poor and there's the rich. I actually think that what critical race theory is doing is actually being more nuanced than that in two ways. One, when it talks about intersectionality, it's a way more nuanced way of thinking about
Mhm.
how we navigate our societies, that we can be multiple things, right? That I, as a black male, can both be a victim to racial oppression and also participates in patriarchy, right?
We're really excited about our main guest today, who is Dr. Drew G.I. Hart. He's joining us for the second time. He is an author, activist, and a professor at Messiah University, and the author of Who Will Be a Witness and Trouble I've Seen. Thanks so much for coming back on the podcast, Dr. Hart.
Yeah, glad to be here. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, so today we're talking about something that's not controversial at all and shouldn't get anyone upset. We're talking about critical race theory. And so, why don't we just dive right in and ask if you could please define critical race theory for us? There seems to be like a lot of confusion and conflicting information about what it actually is. So, just in a nutshell, I know it's a huge field, but in a short nutshell, could you kind of define it for us?
Yeah, I think so. I would probably give maybe two different ways of defining what it is. First and foremost, it was critical legal studies um, that developed right after the civil rights movement. You have folks like Derek Bell and others who are thinking about the ways that there's so much work that needed to be done after the civil rights movement was done. And so, wanting to have a tool to analyze how racism is embedded in law and policy and systems and structures all throughout our society, and ways to name that and have a way of identifying that through our legal system so that we can actually challenge and change those things. Um, and then I would say that it does have a second, a little slightly broader, that there are other academic disciplines that are kind of second tier critical race theory as well, still on the graduate level. Um, so in some fields around in sociology and education and such, the insights from critical race theory as a tool has also been applied to other academic disciplines as well. Um, and so, but even still, it's a tool, it's an academic discipline to analyze and identify racism in systems, policies, practices, how it's embedded in everyday life, how it intersects, and yeah, it's basically just a tool to name, identify, and then ultimately transform the way that racism is embedded in our society.
So that sounds pretty boring and academic, but it's obviously here in the US, it's very much of a hot button issue. People are talking about it all the time. John Oliver just did a piece on it last week. Uh, why is it if it's such an innocuous, ivory towers sort of high level academia stuff? Why is it such a hot button issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think first we just have to acknowledge that folks, there are white people in the United States in particular that are, I don't know if uncomfortable seems like an understatement, but, uh, you know, well, we'll just say uncomfortable with the shifts that are taking place in our society, especially in response to the last wave of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Mhm.
Um, and maybe fear, maybe is also a helpful word at this point, right? Fear of the changes that are coming. And so there's a large swath of our population that are primed for backlash, right? So that I think is important. And then to understand like what the big hype is right now is that there are folks who intentionally and willfully sought to grab something random, which happened to be in this case critical race theory, and they intentionally and willfully distorted it, willfully misrepresented it, in terms of what it actually is, and then sought to disparage it and label everything that was anti-racism, calling it critical race theory, right? And so there's multiple. It's a misrepresenting and
The boogeyman.
distorting what it is. And, right, it's a boogeyman distorting it and then labeling anything that they wanted to. That it's almost like the way one way I've said it is, it'd be like me who like I don't like country music. All right, no offense to anybody that does, but I also don't like
Solid opinion.
solid opinion. But I also don't like listen to like country music. Like I just have a vague understanding of what it is. I don't know the fine boundaries of critical race of country music. But it'd be like me saying like, I don't like country music. I want to ban country music, and then banning like every white person that does any form of music at all, right? Like that's almost the equivalent of what's happening right now. Um, and so I think that the willful misrepresenting and then labeling everything it kind of shows its cards of what it actually is about. This is an effort to shut down efforts around anti-racism and racial justice. That's what this is about. And it really has nothing to do with critical race theory itself.
So can I ask
Yeah.
just ask one more question about that from the sort of definitional how we use the term. A while ago, Titus and I actually had a discussion about the term critical race theory. And he kind of did a spit take when I was like, well, yeah, I kind of use critical race theory in my classroom. I teach middle school English, and I teach middle school English to indigenous people in a tribal school. And in my sort of layman's perspective, when I say, yeah, critical race theory sort of informs some of what I do, I was saying that we read about the history of oppression of indigenous people and Black people in the United States. We talk about historical racism, the intentional inequalities historically. We talk about reservation systems, treaties, boarding schools, things like that. And then we ask, we don't have boarding schools as such for the most part anymore. And boy, this is a whole nother can of worms, but at least some of the treaty rights have been restored, etc. So why do we still see the lingering effects of this today? And so I guess I've kind of equated critical race theory with sort of a look at the systemic racial issues that people face today. Is that am I wrong? Can Titus gloat about me being wrong in saying that critical race theory informs, or am I just taking a more popular level understanding?
I mean, it's complicated, right? It's a little bit complicated. So I would say you're not teaching critical race theory, though you may be influenced by the fields
Exactly.
of critical race theory indirectly, right? So critical race theory helped to give us language to identify these things. And so even if it's secondhand, like, secondhand smoke, you've been shaped by the discourses of critical race theory indirectly and are allowing that to shape to identify policies, practices, systems, structures, all that are shaping, contemporary life. But you're not teaching critical race theory, right? Like
Yeah.
your students are not reading Derek Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw.
Oh, should I
Like
remove
that would
that from my
be,
syllabus?
like,
No, I'm
like I
joking.
always
I'm
say to
joking.
folks, like, if there are elementary and middle school students who are like studying like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, they need like an applause, right?
Yeah.
Because these are like super students. These are like, high achievers. And they shouldn't be banned. They need to, just keep letting them loose because they're clearly overachievers already. So I think that to differentiate the actual field and discipline of critical race theory from then some of the insights that have kind of seeped and been immersed into our society, I think is a
Okay.
good differentiation.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. So basically what I hear you saying, Dr. Hart, is that critical race theory is basically tobacco and secondhand smoke. No. No, that is helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So one of the biggest objections that I've read from Christians is that it is promoting Marxism, and that is like, oh no, you can't do that. It's almost like, they're akin to saying you're trying to promote a Marxist government or something like that. Could you explain from your perspective what the link is between critical race theory, critical theory, and Marxism as an, academic thought thing, not as in a march down the street with the sickle and hammer type thing?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question because so it'd be ingenuous to say there's no connection, right? In the sense that Marxism is a discipline that sought to analyze power as it relates to, you know, the elite class and the proletariat, right? Like, but it also was much more than that, right? It's a ideology and a narrative. I mean, in some ways, you could almost call it a religion, right? In terms of its full kind of scope, if you take it in that fullest sense of Marxism. But in the sense that it is identifying the material conditions of society, there are a lot of different disciplines that have both took insights from that and also critiqued it, right? And I think that critical race theory, just like post-colonialism, you could say uh, took some insights from it and also were devastating critiques of Marxism also, right? So I guess the question, if someone were to say it was, teaching Marxism, I would say in what way? Tell me what in specific ways do you see that? Because they're using it in ways that they don't even know what they're talking about. Because it's not a Marxist ideology, right? It's not a Marxist narrative that it's telling. In fact, it doesn't try to do that kind of work. And but to the degree that it is also concerned about the material embodied experience of people, then yes, maybe it has some little bit in relationship to Marxism, but in some ways not very little, and not that I think that it's stretching to claim that it is promoting Marxism. I don't even know how anybody other than talking about so Derek Bell might talk about self-interests, right? Or something like there's some of those like broad ideas, but who's going to deny that people don't have self-interests and that people
Yeah,
don't make decisions based on self-interests? Yeah.
there's a sense in which like socialism, Marxist theories, and colonialism and post-colonial theories and CRT are very broadly talking about the connection between or talking about how society impacts the individual and the connection between society and the individual. And so anytime you're talking about some sort of approach to a community or a group, for some of our Western minded Christians, anything that's not rugged individualism is dirty communism. Is
Right.
that maybe oversimplification? But that's kind of the vibe I get, that it's actually a complaint against anything that strikes against individualism rather than a nuanced understanding of Marxism or CRT.
Yeah,
Titus,
yeah.
are
I
you
mean,
back with us?
Yeah. One thing that I've heard people critiquing CRT, one way that I've heard them link it to Marxism is saying that it divides the world into two very distinct categories, oppressed and oppressor. So, for example, I had an employee once, or I had an employee last year who was pretty far left. He was a white guy, and he informed me that all white people are doing some base level harm unless they really seek to understand racism and become like anti-racist activists, that we're all doing some level of harm because we're all oppressors. Is that accurate?
so, but the funny thing is that critical race theory, if you actually take it seriously, is actually softening the blow a little bit, right? In fact, I often tell people, like, if you want to read a text that oversimplifies into a binary of oppressed and oppressor, read certain biblical passages, right? And it's very just clean. There's oppressors and there's the oppressed, right? There's the poor and there's the rich. I actually think that what critical race theory is doing is actually being more nuanced than that in two ways. One, when it talks about intersectionality, it's a way more nuanced way of thinking about how we navigate our societies, that we can be multiple things, right? That I, as a black male, can both be a victim to racial oppression and also participates in patriarchy, right? And so there's complexities that are actually being named because of our multifaceted realities that we live into, and the different interlocking systems of oppression that exists in our society. So it's actually critical race theory that is actually trying to nuance the conversation around these things and not just say this binary. And so it's actually frustrating when I hear people say critical race theory just wants this binary of oppressed and oppressor. I'm like, that's not actually a good reading of critical race theory. And the other aspect of it is the challenging of essentialism, right? This idea that we are one essential kind of thing as a race or a people. It's again pushing against it and seeing the nuances of our own unique personalities and peoplehood. And so I do think that yes, they do acknowledge, critical race theory absolutely acknowledges that there is such a thing as oppression and that there are people engaging in that are oppressing and that are oppressed, but also are nuancing that to also help us think about the multi-dimensional ways that we live into that because of the complex systems, right? And I can give an example. Um, when I was when I was a college student, every summer I worked in warehouses to help pay for school and stuff. And one summer I worked at, it was a nursing scrubs place, right? They sold nursing scrubs, and what was fascinating is the way in which if you looked inside the main warehouse, it was mainly people of color working. And if you looked at in the office, it was mostly white women there working, right? And if you looked at those who were managers, it was mostly white men. And there was only a very small percentage of women of color in this institution, right? And in some ways, now if somebody said this is racist, right? Well, traditionally for a long time, people say, no, it's not racist. Look, there's black people here, right? Or you say it's sexist then. Well, no, it's not sexist. Look, there's white women working and so intersectionality says, look, we need to pay attention to the complexities of what happens when these things overlap together, and create unique experiences for women of color in particular, right? That's, as one example. And so I think that it's that nuancing actually is quite powerful, and it removes us from just having these simple binaries of only oppressed and oppressor. Those are important categories, but sometimes they don't help explain all the nuances of what's going on in our society.
Yeah, so thinking about this Christianly, what should be our response? So there's this academic field, CRT, that has kind of bled down into popular culture. And say someone listening to this wants to stand up for the marginalized, wants to fight racism. How can we draw from critical race theory in positive ways to do that work?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is in the New Testament, at various points, both Paul and the author of the book of Hebrews both kind of hints at Plato's cave, right? They're talking about shadows, the shadow of the true form. These are non-Christian ways of analyzing and thinking about the world that these Christian authors have grabbed and used, because they felt like it was helpful in articulating the new thing that God has done in Jesus Christ, right? And so I think that it's just that simple, right? That there are lots of different tools available to us, that they don't have to be like this idea that it's not the gospel. It was never claiming to be the gospel. It's claiming to be an academic discipline. And we have always used academic, I mean, Christians use cookbooks, right? That aren't necessarily proclaiming Jesus, right? But we find it helpful as we gather in community, maybe to cook a meal and use this cookbook from someone who had no intentions of proclaiming Jesus, right? And the same thing, if we have intentions to pursue God's new creation, God's reign breaking into our world, to participate in that, to seek after it, to participate in God's justice and peacemaking, then absolutely we can use these tools that are able to help us do that work even more carefully and more nuanced. And so I think that that's the way that we have always used knowledge, right? If knowledge is neither sacred nor secular, it's either true or it's not true. And so we need to figure out what helps us understand the world in ways that yield to the preeminence of Jesus Christ in all things, right? And all of it then is good for engaging our intellects, our minds, our understanding, and helping us to actually concretely love our neighbors and care for those that are disproportionately suffering in the world. And so, to the degree that, and I would let me just add one more thing. Many of the, like Derek Bell, who's often considered like the father of critical race theory, like he was a Christian, right? I think it was he like AME or Methodist or something. Like he was a Christian himself, right? And so the idea that critical race theory is just this secular thing, the fact of the matter is that there's proto critical race theory, which is the work that Christians have been doing, honestly, for centuries, certainly in this land, in the United States, that developed into what we now call critical race theory in terms of the academic discipline. So it's this kind of simple binary is just not a truthful telling. I mean, in some ways, Dr. King is just as much a proto, figure to critical race theory as also Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois and so forth. And so I think there's this long legacy that builds up to create something that we now call critical race theory that isn't explicitly Christian, but certainly isn't anti in and of itself either.
In
Yeah.
academia, it's like, I don't, my impression more and more is that so much of this is from Christendom and from Christian language and lingo, that it's so centered in Christianity that other yeah.
Yeah, it's so deeply influenced by Christians who are committed to the work of justice over the long haul, and that has shaped as people took those convictions with them into the workplace, into the academics, right, into all these different spheres. It has shaped the kind of work that they do in those spaces. And so Derek Bell went into legal studies and saw the limits of it. And it was his Christian imagination that pressed him to ask different kind of questions that could continue to allow justice to roll down like waters and righteousness like ever-flowing streams.
Yeah, I wonder what some of the folks that are protesting critical race theory would say to the like the example in Acts where you have one group of people saying, hey, we're not being cared for, our widows aren't being cared for. And the answer was not to, oh, they're just complaining, they're just playing the race card, or they're just playing the ethnic card. The response is, we need to pay attention better to them. Maybe the apostles can't. Let's actually appoint people. Let's appoint critical race theory experts and call them deacons, although they weren't necessarily called deacons in quite the same way there in Acts, and have them pay special attention to make sure there's not inequity in the family of Christ.
Yeah, and a radical response, right? All 7 of the deacons have Hellenistic names instead of, Greek names instead of Hebraic names. And so this is a radical, like the first or last, last or first kind of response that we see in the early church that is taking seriously power dynamics, which I think is one of the concerns why people don't like critical race theory, is because it's exposing the power dynamics in our society that are being abused and misused for domination and for harm instead of for flourishing and the well-being and common good of all people.
So what are some ways that white people in the US, because the majority of our listeners to That Jesus Podcast are white, what are some ways that we can, whether we're like explicitly informed by that, by critical race theory, or just the trickle down effect, what are ways that we can respond? What are the ways that we can engage and care for and push back against, frankly, the majority face of Christianity, which sees critical race theory as heresy?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of tricky. Like, what's the best response? I mean, some of it is if you're going to enter into conversation, make people be particular, right? Because people are speaking abstractly. So let's have an actual conversation. So if someone says, critical race theory splits people into oppressors and the oppressed, ask them what critical race theory they've read, right? And let's have a conversation and say, I invite you, let's read Derek Bell together and have a conversation about it, right? And then you can help me see where this is happening, and then we can go on there. So as long as it's not staying in this abstract way that continues to distort, misrepresent, and disparage, right?
Personalize it.
Right. But if we then actually you may be able to invite them into a learning moment where they can actually engage the material and think about what it actually means for their own lives. So that's maybe one strategy. But I mean, the other thing is, I mean, there are lots of resources. You could also invite them to look at some of the books that have been banned, right? I mean, I think they were banning like Ruby Bridges, the children's book on Ruby Bridges, story of integrating a school. Like, what does that have
Wow.
to do with critical race theory or, The Hate You Give, right? A novel,
Hmm.
1619, right? History. Basically, like the common theme is black authors who are writing about racism in any way or form. That's the common denominator. And I think that we can have, again, specific conversations about what is it about this particular resource. If you actually believe that it's critical race theory, then let's look at it together, and you help me. You can make it, put it on them, right? Help me
Hmm.
see what's so wrong about this text, because I'm
Hmm.
not seeing what you're defining it as. And so that's maybe one strategy. But I also think on going on the flip side is to go, which the other direction I said, which is to invite them to read the Bible, right? Because the very things that they're accusing critical race theory of, the Bible is actually guilty of. It's
Hmm.
it's calling them and their lives oppressors, right? Often.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's an invitation for them to come with the starkness of the accusations of the Bible, and how it actually points the finger in maybe ways that the critical race theory doesn't. And then they can decide if they want to ban the Bible as well, or if they want to immerse themselves nonetheless in the birth, life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
One of the things that I hear, just around the schoolyard, um, not my schoolyard, but just in general, is this idea. So does this mean we have to apologize for being white? Does this mean that I need to be teaching my children they should be ashamed for being white? And I don't think that's what critical race theory is teaching. But if that's actually a message they're receiving, how can we respond to that?
Well, first, I would want to ask, what do we mean when we use the word white, right? Um, because are we talking about, I'm assuming that when they say that it's making their kids feel bad for being white, they just mean for being of European descent in the way that they look, right?
Hmm.
And I would say there's nothing wrong with being of European descent. It's a beautiful thing, and there's nothing wrong with having lighter, less pigmentation in one's skin, right? It's just a part of God's diversity. Not everyone can be blessed with all the melanin, right? Um, but that said, we also have to talk about, like, what does whiteness actually mean? What are we actually talking about? And why are kids responding the way that they are to just facts, historical facts,
Hmm.
right? And the fact of the matter is that, so if we go back to the 14th century, and you said, let's get all the white people together, like in Germany or UK or whatever, nobody would know what you're talking about, right? Because there's the idea of whiteness has not even emerged as a thing yet. No
Hmm.
one, so white was constructed, it was developed, it grew, it became a thing over centuries, and it's directly in conversation and in flow with colonial conquest and slavery, right?
Yeah.
That's the only reason why whiteness developed as a thing. It was a justification
For
for
slavery.
right, for slavery and conquest, for plundering and exploitation of
Mhm.
lands and people's bodies, and lives. And so if that's the case, and they identify with whiteness in that way, what has been constructed, then I would say it actually is not a good thing. You should not want to participate in something that is about social domination and plunder and exploitation of other people. And so, in that sense, there is some, not guilt or feeling bad about oneself, but repentance, confession, repentance, lament, and transformation that needs to happen. If we're followers of Jesus, then those things are incompatible with the way of Jesus, right? Even Jesus said himself, right, that the Gentiles lorded over you, but not so, right? There's a different kind of way for followers of Jesus. And so if that's the case, then that kind of being white, for the purpose of exploiting others, being apathetic to the concerns and not seeing other people as fully human, right? That those things are incompatible, and actually there actually does need to be a change. So I would say, if children are feeling bad because of who they are, because of their ethnicity or how they look, then we want to affirm the image of God in them. But if they're
Mhm.
feeling bad because of the history of European enslavement and colonization, and they're shocked and horrified by it, and they're seeing their communal ties and sense of belonging to the community that did those harmful things, then they shouldn't be shielded from the truth and the historical realities of what happened. They actually needed to be carefully guided through, mentored through, with sensitivity and awareness to all the harm that's been done, and inviting them into different ways of living so that they don't repeat those things anymore. And so I think that that's the nuanced conversation around the making our children feel bad conversation that's not being had.
Yeah. And so often I think people do feel bad because people are talking about how racism has impact that extends to today. Even if you aren't going around chasing a black guy in a pickup truck and shooting him, you're still in a sense a participant or a beneficiary of the system. It feels bad because not because it makes me as an individual Christian look bad, but because it makes my quote unquote country look bad. And because my identity as a Christian is inextricable from my identity as an American, if you make my country look bad by talking about, say the 1619 Project, well, then you make Jesus look bad because Jesus is my country, and this is my this is my frustration.
They need to read Jesus and the Disinherited.
Yes, they do. Yeah.
So, Dr. Hart, are there any ways that the critical race theory, the actual thing, would run afoul of a biblical worldview, of a Jesus-centered, kingdom-centered approach? Can critical race theory go too far?
So I would say any individual scholar or theory can go too far. So I mean, I think that you have to read each case by case like we do everything, right? Like I would also say every preacher can go too far. In fact, we have plenty of evidence that many preachers have misrepresented who Jesus Christ is, have affirmed him as a slaveholder, as a colonizer, as identifying with the rich and powerful. And so we have to be careful discerners of everything that we engage, both in the church, unfortunately, as well as in the broader society. So there's nothing special about it in that sense. So I would never give wholesale just anything a critical race theorist says, you just got to eat it and swallow it whole. I'd say be careful readers of everyone. And there's probably some critical race theorists that are more helpful and some that aren't, right? And that there are, even among critical race theorists, lively debates and different ways that people talk about how to understand our society and the racialized society that we live in. And so we should be attentive to the nuances even within the conversations within critical race theory. In some ways, critical race theory is really critical race theories, plural, right? Yeah. It's a conversation, and that we can actually be a part of it. And if we're concerned about the direction of some of it, well, then join the conversation, right? Go get your masters and your degrees, and join the conversation. You can participate in shaping the direction towards something more redemptive and liberative. But again, that someone would only do that if they actually cared about seeking the flourishing of all humanity and seeking God's new creation in light of the white supremacy that has shaped our society for centuries. One would opt out of that and just disparage the whole thing if one actually just wanted to, challenge all efforts of anti-racism and racial justice.
Well said. You have anything else to add there, Rebecca?
I was just thinking, like, having conversations about the subject, that some of this anti-CRT thing is like an attempt to maintain a control of voice. Because in post-colonial theory, talk about like who controls voice and speech. So I guess one question I have is how does Christian who might be, say, American or white, or just how do they go through that process of recognizing that maybe there's some that we need to listen to other voices, or not have to maintain that kind of control of voice? Is there a kind of like recommendation or that you might have on that?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I argue in my first book, Trouble I've Seen, I make a case for, I call it counterintuitive solidarity. And my argument is both historical and then theological, right? Historical in the sense of most white American Christians as well would agree that the majority of white Christians got it wrong in the past, right? 1619 all the way up to 1865. Most of them agree, Christians got it wrong, that they were on the wrong side of history. That's how people would say it today, right? In fact, most are shocked. I can't believe how could a white person have done that? How could they twist the Bible in such ways,
I
right?
would never.
Right, I would never, right? And so there's this shock and condemnation of folks in the past. Um, and they believe that, they would, if you ask them, was Frederick Douglass right or Sojourner Truth right, they'd say yes. If you ask them about Ida B. Wells or, W.E.B. Du Bois, they'd say yes, right? If you ask them about King and other, they say yes all
They'd
the way
actually say,
through.
wait, who's that? Huh?
Yeah, if they knew the names, right? Yeah. And so, but what's fascinating is that now, right, 400 years in, they think that they once again have the right position and don't need to listen to anybody else. And so my critique has always been, what are the odds that the community that's been right for 350 years and the community that's been wrong for 350 years suddenly instantaneously all swap positions in terms of epistemological advantage, right? There are ways of knowing, and now white people know better and black people don't know their own lived experience, right? Like, what are the odds? Or the other way is that, to think about it in terms of that social location actually shapes our understanding, and that some social locations provide limited perspectives, right? And if you are part of a community that's a part of a dominant culture and that has been oppressing and dominating other people, that maybe you don't have the best vantage point for understanding what's going on in other people's lived experiences. And so then I think about it theologically, and I think about like First Corinthians, where Paul says that God, that he came to preach Christ crucified as his message, and that in that the power of God and the wisdom of God are being expressed in that, right? That's who God is expressed in the crucified Christ. And then just so we don't miss the point, he goes on, because some people might think it's an atonement theology point. He goes on, or in some ways you could say it is, but not in the way that people think it is. He says, God has chosen the weak to shame the strong, and God has chosen those that are considered nothing to shame those that are considered something, right? That's how God works in the world. That God is actually working on the axis of vulnerability within the world, and that we ought to be participating in that. And if that's true, then as followers of Jesus, especially those who are born and shaped and socialized in white dominant culture, ought to then position themselves to explore the world from the vantage point of the crucified Christ, right? And that means that they need to be in solidarity and listening to the stories and experiences of those that have been crucified in the world, and holding it as though those stories and experiences are sacred, and allowing them to transform their life and their way of seeing the world and understanding the world. And once they've done that, then they'll be free to go and explore the worlds from a different vantage point.
Dr. Hart, we really appreciate your time. I have a couple more questions that I wanted to ask, but they're a little too juicy. So I want to keep them for our Patreon supporters. So if anyone wants to sign up for Patreon, you can hear Dr. Hart answer a question about a mowing client I have, which is a Civil War museum that flies the Confederate flag, and also what he thinks about Candace Owens and Dr. Vodi Bakum. So go over to Patreon and you'll hear some really interesting tidbits there. But for the rest of y'all, thank you all so much for tuning in. Unless anyone else here on the call has any final thoughts you want to throw in.
Thanks, Dr. Hart, for always bringing it back to the kingdom and back to the upside down worldview that Jesus calls us to.